right. I'd like to welcome everybody here to the Founders Day Forum. This is the first event that we're having for Founding Week this year, and an academic discussion of some of the things that go on at the American University of Paris. And the forum is really today an opportunity for us to reflect upon AUP's founding promise of international cooperation and cultural exchange, and to consider the expanded ways in which AUP continues to build upon and to deliver on the original promise that was made by the founder, both within and outside the classroom. We often do this. We often reflect upon the journey that led Lloyd Delamiter to the founding of AUP in 1962, and by his own account, his pathway evolved long before the actual founding of the institution, and it began from a long series of conversations that he had with his wife and with others over the years, comparing American and French value systems, and long discussions throughout the years about how to transcend the bounds of narrow nationalism. How do you translate between different cultural understandings? How do you bridge different cultural positions? Dr. Delamiter envisioned, as he went through these discussions, founding a college that would provide opportunities to open up the experiences of students to other cultures and ways of being in the world, where students would have opportunities for and become experienced in international living and understanding. AUP really does continue to deliver on this vision. It's a place that nurtures multicultural and multidisciplinary perspectives, where experiences are designed to lead students outside their own original cultural and intellectual comfort zones to experience a degree of discomfort, a sense of being not at home, to developing understanding and compassion for others. AUP is created and is an active member of a consortia of 22 American universities across Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. It has long since evolved from a small college to a 4-year comprehensive university that welcomes students from over 100 different nationalities and has a mission and students and faculty constituencies that are really quite unique. We graduate students every year who then return to their societies after their years at the American University of Paris. Sometimes we ought to really investigate and ask what's entailed in this process of transcending narrow nationalisms, of cross-cultural understandings. And this is a matter of considerable debate and considerable variation. As an anthropologist, I often think about this kind of cross-cultural experience in a very profound way. Susan Sontag wrote about this experience of being not at home in an essay called The Anthropologist as Hero, in which she described the anthropological experience as one where its practitioners extend themselves deep into another culture, where they come to the brink of losing themselves in the experience of another. It's not just about building bridges, it's about being transformed yourself in the experience. You come not just to a profound realization of what it means to be part of another culture, but you actually see yourself transformed so much that when you return to your own culture, you see it differently than before you left it. Not everybody sees it in quite the same profound way that I can describe it here in terms of anthropology, but it certainly is an experience that should be a transformative experience for our students when they go through it. So today I'm going to invite two professors, Professor Susan Perry and Stephen Sawyer, to reflect upon some of the ways in which professors and students at AUP continue to build upon and extend AUP's founding mission of cultural understanding. So first I'll call upon you, Susan, Professor Susan Perry, Program Director for the Master's Degree in International Affairs, a scholar and an activist who focuses on vulnerable populations whose rights are at risk.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Provost for inviting both Professor Sawyer and myself this afternoon. I'm going to talk a bit about my work and the interaction between AUP and the work that I'm doing at the moment. So as we all know, AUP is a laboratory for international cooperation and cultural exchange. Our first president, Lloyd DeLameter, was a highly cultivated man, a diplomat who believed that American liberal arts education in Europe would provide students with a very rich university experience. And 60 years later, this is still the case. And all of us at AUP benefit from these rich cultural exchanges within a framework of international cooperation. In fact, so much so that we take it for granted, but this is not the norm. And my work outside of AUP makes that abundantly clear. So, as the provost said, my teaching focuses on human rights. Human rights are by nature international, but their implementation is always national, as Fred Einbinder knows all too well, our law professor here in the audience today. We have a state-centric UN system which obliges states to sign, ratify treaties, and then hopefully respect them. So as a member of the French National Human Rights Commission, my colleagues and I work to advise and also at times to require the French government to uphold its international human rights obligations. And today I'd like to present an example of our work that has been deeply informed by my experience at AUP, and also in which my students are beginning to become increasingly involved. I find AUP an extraordinarily important sounding board, particularly because the perspective on international cooperation and cultural exchange is so rich here. Our students are much more interesting for me to reflect with than my colleagues on the French Human Rights Commission. They have a broader vision, even though they're much younger. So this is a challenging project that I'm working on. It has to do with deported Ukrainian children to Russia. According to the Ukraine government, 16,226 children have been deported to Russia from Ukraine in the past 12 months. Russia itself has acknowledged transferring 2,000 children without guardians. They call these transfers rescues, medical rehabilitation initiatives, and adoption programs. A study by the Yale School for Public Health has confirmed over 6,000 transferred Ukrainian children who have been subject to forced adoptions, but also torture and sexual violence in more than 43 re-education camps across Russia. So we don't know how many children have been transferred. And it's very important to know that many children were originally voluntarily sent to Russia to escape the bombing by their parents at the beginning of the war, particularly in the Donbass and the southeastern Ukrainian regions. The problem is that once these children arrive in Russia, the parents either lose all trace of them or they are unable to get them back if the parent, for example, would like to move to Western Ukraine. And so these transfers are occurring without full consent. In some cases, there has been consent, but in all cases, there has not been full consent, and in some cases, there's been no consent at all. And as I'm sure you're well aware, most countries in the world have signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Russia is one such country, and such transfers violate nearly all the articles, the clauses of the Convention on the Rights of the Child that Russia has ratified. Now, because this is war, these transfers also violate international humanitarian law, which governs our conduct in wartime. There are two specific areas that I think are most interesting today. The first is War Crime 8.2, which is unlawful deportation or transfer or unlawful confinement. And the second is genocide, because Article 6E of the Rome Statute prohibits forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The International Criminal Court has responded by issuing to these transfers by issuing a mandate for two individuals, President Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, who is the National Commissioner for Children's Rights. The mandate is for deportation as a war crime under Articles 8.2a7 and 8.2b8. Now, genocide will probably eventually be added if either one of these individuals is ever brought into custody in The Hague. And Germany has already announced that they will arrest Putin if he sets foot on German territory. It would be, I think, advisable for the French state to do the same. They haven't done so yet. Now, Ukraine is a really interesting case of divided international cooperation. We talk a lot about international cooperation at AUP. We study divided international cooperation in our classrooms. At the UN General Assembly, 141 member states have condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. 32 states have abstained, and 6 continue to support Russia. From a cultural point of view, this is also a really complicated situation. And again, it's our training at AUP that allows us to look at a more nuanced version of this problem. It's not a black and white issue. It is a very complicated issue. Kiev in Ukraine was founded by the Vikings in 882, more than 500 years before the founding of Muscovy, Russia. Kiev and Rus included much of modern-day Belarusia, Ukraine, and portions of Western Russia. And according to Timothy Snyder, who's really the leading Ukraine scholar at Yale, the history of Kiev and the surrounding lands embraces certain European trends that are less pronounced in Russia. So essentially, his analysis is that Ukraine is European and Russia is Eurasian. Now, you may or may not agree with this analysis, but it's something to keep in mind because this isn't what the Russians think. The Russians consider Ukraine part of Russia, and it's often called Little Russia. Putin said in a July 2021 speech that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, they form a single whole, and that they are bound together by one language, economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and the Orthodox faith. Now, many of you who read the news know there are a lot of divisions forming along these lines today. So this is a case of profound cultural misunderstanding despite centuries of cultural exchange. It's the kind of cultural misunderstanding that we don't see often, for example, in an AUP classroom. And it's informed by something else that I think we often lose sight of. Russia experienced a traumatic fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and that has contributed to a population decline of 3 million people over the past 30 years. As you're probably aware, most countries are experiencing population increase, or have over the past 30 years. Russia has experienced a decline. That decline has been slightly accelerated by COVID. They lost about 660,000 people to COVID. There's an unknown number of war deaths. We have no idea. And we also know that during war, births are often delayed because we have soldiers who are on the front lines, and we also have draft dodgers. We know that Kazakhstan has declared in September alone that they received 98,000 Russian males, most of them of childbearing age. They were provided with visas to live in Kazakhstan. You also have a very low life expectancy in Russia, 69 years compared to 80 in the EU. So this combination forms a perfect storm. And as your own birth rate drops, how convenient to adopt your neighbor's children. We have research that's been ongoing. Interestingly enough, most of the information on this crisis is open source information available in Russian. And the Yale School for Public Health, for example, has used AI to parse through this information. They've geolocated 43 re-education centers. We think there are many more, but we know the location of 43. Some of them are in Siberia, or there's one in Magadan, which is near Vladivostok. So these children are coming from, say, Mariupol into a holding center in Russia when they cross the border, sometimes with a parent. They're then separated, and then they're sent all the way across this enormous landmass to Russia. This is a complex logistical system with a militarized element. Many of the photographs that are available online demonstrate that there are people in uniform who are working on the movement of these children. And please keep in mind that almost in all war situations, including in Russia during World War II, there's a moratorium on adoptions. It's usually the first thing that happens in wartime because the goal is to track down families and reconnect children with their parents if they're separated. Now, a variety of organizations are tracking these missing children, but there's almost no international organization or coordination to organize their return. And it's surprising to me. And we're slowly but surely making this surprising to the French Human Rights Commission and the French government as well. 308 children have been rescued because they have determined parents or guardians who have reclaimed them physically in Crimea or in Russia itself. Some children have been old enough to organize their own return. Interestingly enough, cell phones often haven't been taken from children, which demonstrates to me that this isn't an evil genius organizing a massive deportation of children. It's a well-organized but fairly loose movement of children out of Ukraine and into Russia. Those that remain in the camps, I fear, may be either forcibly adopted, exploited, or exchanged for high-profile Russian prisoners at the end of the war. Now, most of you know me as a sort of a confirmed Luddite. I work on the regulation of technology in peacetime, but war is different. And I am fully supportive of the use of all open source information to gather evidence. I know that the French gendarmerie also is using the dark web to gather evidence on this. Geolocation tracking is fine with me. Cell phones to contact victims is very useful. And there's been an enormous amount of human-to-human transmission of information as well. In fact, most of the information that organizations have comes from human beings, not from machines. There are also technology-based solutions that will need to be pursued if we're going to eventually locate these children. We have DNA tracing. How we do that DNA tracing, how we organize it, is a knot that eventually we're going to have to untie. Facial recognition technology. Extremely interesting, and in this particular case, very useful because we can project what a child will look like in 2 to 3 years' time from a photograph. And then some Ukrainian parents are demanding microchips from the Ukrainian state to place in their children so that they don't lose them. And I find that startling, to say the least. And so I've been working with my students to devise questions that I can then bring to the French Human Rights Commission to better understand what it is we need to do in order to organize the eventual return of most of these children. The first question our students came up with, this was an exercise that we ran in class last week, is how to encourage Russian citizens to cooperate with the return of Ukrainian children. Some people think that they're doing the right thing by adopting these children. They have very little exposure to Western news. These children need a home, and they are happy to bring them in, and they receive a subsidy from the state to do so. And then if these children were to be returned, which organization or entity should run such a practical project, and with what authority? Please remember that Russia is a member of the UN Security Council and will have the presidency for the latter half of 2023. Clearly, we're not going to get any authority from the UN Security Council, but I believe we need authority to act. What sort of technical guardrails will be necessary for this type of a project? How do we use facial recognition technology, DNA testing? What if parents do implant microchips in their children? What are the ethical guidelines for that? Should all children be returned? Some of them are going to be better off in Russia than they would be to return to a devastated Ukrainian city with no parents and maybe an uncle or an aunt available to take them in with no money. And then if we do get the children back, what do we do with their data once they return? So these are questions that I think I wouldn't have ever been able to get the French Human Rights Commission to come up with, but in an AUP classroom, this is entirely possible. So to conclude, AUP's ethos of international cooperation and cultural exchange encourages our students to formulate really smart questions, to act on our values, to explore creative solutions, and find justice in the case of intractable problems. I've been teaching at AUP since 1988, working with my students to make Delameter's vision the norm, not the exception, for the world at large. So thank you very much. All set? Do you have online questions as well? I don't know. Yes.
Are there any kind of precedents from other situations for some of the technology stuff you were talking about, and anything that can be used even if it's not as a full parallel, but another example from the past that can help us understand how, for example, a microchips might be
So we have all kinds of missing children protocols. You have Opération Ambre in France. You have Amber. You have all kinds of protocols. We could use those, but it's the scale of this. So the highest number that's official is 16,000. According to the French gendarmerie, to the people that we auditioned last week, they think that there's about 100,000 children who have been removed. So that's so no matter what we've been doing with the individual missing child whose face is on a milk carton, this is a very different situation. So we have no precedent, and that's why I feel much more at home beginning the conversation here, and then moving back to an instance which is actually very franco-français, and trying to get the French state, possibly with other human rights commissions across Europe, to begin pushing governments to set up structures for when we'll be able to act. So, all set? Any other questions? No? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Sawyer, the Valentine Levitt Professor of History, also Director of AUP's Center for Critical Democracy Studies, and Steve's research focuses on the history and theory of democracy.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in these events. And I guess I'm struck that as we gather here today, we are once again amidst a city in revolt, with movements that are challenging not just the specific policy for the pension system that's been under debate, but also in some cases suggesting that what is at stake is democracy itself. As you know, at issue is not just the debate about the retirement age, but also the constitutional provision, the famous 49.3, the 49.3, Article 49.3, which gives the Prime Minister of France the right to pass legislation without a vote by the Parliament. At that point, as was the case most recently, the government can be brought before a vote of no confidence before the entire Assembly. Now, in this case, since the vote of no confidence did not pass, the legislation passed. Now, it's important to note that from a juridical and constitutional perspective, the use of Article 49.3 and the passage of the law on the pension system is uncontestable. It is constitutional. In spite of its constitutionality, however, the law remains contested. And one of the most common critiques, if you look at the newspapers or if you're out in the streets, is that even if it is constitutional, it has been undemocratic. From this perspective, what is being challenged by some in the streets of Paris today is a certain conception of democracy that framed the creation of the current French Constitution at the outset of the Fifth Republic. In this way, what is at stake is not so much democracy in general, but rather a legacy. The legacy of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, the man for whom it was designed, that is Charles de Gaulle, and the powers that came with that executive. Now, I open with this point because for those of us in the AUP community, Parisian demonstrations and uprisings are part of what it means to be here. We have all either been in or experienced one or another, in one way or the other, the highly politicized and politically engaged tradition of Parisian life. But I mention it also because an essential part of the legacy that's being challenged right now, and specifically a cornerstone of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, was also established in 1962, the year AUP was founded. Indeed, 1962 was a foundational year for the French Fifth Republic. It was the year that the French colonization of Algeria came to an official end with the referendum for Algerian independence in the summer of 1962 and the passage of the Accord d'Évian in France, which officially brought the French pursuit of the war against Algerian independence to an end. It was also in the fall of 1962, on October 28th, as I would imagine the first class of students were gathering in the basement of the American church, that a referendum passed with 90%, establishing the election by direct universal suffrage of the French president. So while the Fifth Republic was, of course, officially established in 1958, it is often considered that it's with the end of the Algerian War and the referendum on the presidential election that, in many ways, the Fifth Republic was founded, that is, the same year as AUP. However, as we are seeing before our very eyes, the question of the founding or the founder, and even the very idea of a founding, is relentlessly challenged. I don't think I am saying anything unreasonable or even terribly novel in suggesting that at least part of what is being contested today is the way the constitutional organization of the Fifth Republic was understood to be delivering on democracy by establishing a president who was elected by direct universal suffrage, and the position that this places the parliament, especially when the party of the president does not have an absolute majority in the National Assembly, which is presently the case. In this sense, when we hear the calls against the anti-democratic nature of the passage of the current law, what is being criticized is not so much a denial of democracy as a critique of a certain conception of democracy that was captured by the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. This is another way of saying that democracy has a history. What was perceived as democratic in 1962 may or may not be perceived as such in 2022-23. Understanding democracy not only as a normative horizon, but as a historical, political, and social organization, warts and all, sits at the core of the project of the Center for Critical Democracy Studies here at AUP. Our aim is to show that democracy has, and in fact, more emphatically, is a history. Now, let me suggest how this approach relates to our current political situation in France. I'd just like to take a brief historical detour. I am a historian after all, if you'll indulge me in this, before I return to AUP. Claims of anti-democracy have taken many shapes and forms since the mid-18th century. Today, in the streets of Paris, what is generally meant when it is claimed that this law is anti-democratic is that it's anti-democratic because there was not a vote in the legislature. And so the idea is generally we need to take power from the president and give more power to the National Assembly. It is therefore by extension assumed that the legislative power is more democratic and that the executive, by necessity, is less democratic, let's say. In fact, this assumption about the anti-democratic nature of executive power is the exact opposite of the conception of democracy that animated French political life in the beginning of the Republic in 1789 and still animated the writing of the French Constitution in 1958 and during the referendum of 1962. So how was the executive understood to be democratic in 1962? So here's where I'll be as straightforward as possible, a little deep dive into the history of France and French politics and democracy. I recently published an article entitled "The Forgotten Democratic Tradition of Revolutionary France." Now, what I argue is that the core of this democratic tradition, born in the 18th century and that dominated French conceptions of political power up through the late 20th century, was grounded in three key ideas. First, a distinction between the sovereign and government. In old regime France, the king was understood to be the unquestioned sovereign, as in most European monarchies. France was therefore a monarchical state. This, however, did not mean that the king actually exercised governmental power. That is, the king was not actually involved in how these things would be done. He was simply the sovereign. So he could incarnate the sovereign state and delegate government to someone else. Second, so the first is this distinction between sovereignty and government. Second, however, this left the question of who actually executed legislation entirely open. Now, since Aristotle in Europe, there were three ways of solving this problem. A sovereign king could either execute himself, that was monarchical government and usually referred to as some form of despotism. He could, in the case of France, delegate authority to aristocrats, that was aristocratic government, or he could delegate authority to anybody in the country, and that was considered democratic government. Okay. Now, In one sense, one could argue the democratic regime would resemble a university in which any member of faculty can potentially serve on any committee or potentially hold any position within the administration, but it did not mean that every individual participated in government all the time. It just meant that there were no restrictions on who could be a part of government. The third point is that with the French Revolution, obviously, the king was no longer sovereign. Now the people are sovereign. The people or the nation, therefore, must delegate authority. Now, the question that emerges is, are the people going to delegate authority to a new aristocracy, which is the term, and the term they give to that is what they call representative government. That is, they will elect the best, and those people will make law on behalf of the sovereign. Or will it be a democratic government? And the cornerstone of democratic government under popular sovereignty was that the executive must be elected. That was the cornerstone of it. So in 1789, representative government, or legislative power, is a form of meritocratic aristocracy, and the election of the president is the best example of democratic executive power. So what lessons might we draw from such a rapid history? In short, the institutions remain, but the ideas that animate them can change. What then is a founding? It clearly does not mean an idealization or a fixing of the relationship between ideas and institutions. Rather, I would suggest it implies that to think about founding, we must think about how regimes and institutions can continue to embrace their ideals, ambitions, and actions when the ideas that animate them have radically changed. To think about a founding, therefore, means to confront how our most important values remain, and to think about how these values and the words we use to describe them can be radically changed and challenged. In this sense, founding is a process inscribed in a history and requiring continuous renewal. How may we, in this process of continuous founding, always keeping an eye looking backwards to ensure that we look and build forwards? So looking backwards, it has always struck me that there is something deeply ironic in the creation of ACP in 1962 as France was roaring through the post-war economic boom of the Trente Glorieuses and preparing to entirely rebuild its university system with the creation of a series of new Parisian universities. Take, for example, the fact that in the same year, in February of 1962, a new pedagogical foundation, Fondation Pédagogique, was established for a university in Nanterre that was to include a complex in the suburbs, and that this new campus was based explicitly on a French interpretation of the American campus model, with social sciences and humanities buildings, scientific laboratories, a law school, and a political science institute, as well as a large library and even some grounds, perhaps, for athletics. And yet it was in the same year that ACP brought the liberal arts back to one of the great medieval centers of the liberal arts tradition in Europe. Medieval Paris had excelled in teaching the 7 arts known as libéraux, or what could be loosely translated as liberating or relating to the disciplines of learned or free libre and individuals. That is, those not bound by the various forms of feudal servage. And here, by some great irony, the reincarnation of this extraordinary tradition in which Paris had played such a strong role was taking place through the imitation of the small liberal arts colleges that peppered the United States in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. In 1962, liberal arts were making their fantastic return to Paris in the almost unrecognizable disguise of an American college. But underneath some subterranean continuity of teaching liberal arts, what it meant to pursue the liberal arts had in fact and obviously changed. Even beyond the vast chasm that separated 20th century education from its medieval predecessor, establishing an American-style liberal arts college in Paris necessarily opened a gap with anything that might have existed in the U.S. itself. Liberal arts colleges in the U.S. were still largely regional, and in some cases, very parochial institutions, even though some enjoyed a national reputation. Unlike the educational institutions of continental Europe, small private liberal arts institutions were grounded in the idea that one required a 4-year education before going on to do any other schooling, including medical school or law school. They were in many ways the United States' deeply original contribution to higher education in the world. Every country has produced, of course, in the world has produced great public and private research institutions. Right now, the U.S. is doing quite well in that field, but we don't have a monopoly on that in the U.S. But certainly where the U.S. did something deeply original was with the small liberal arts college. But the undergraduate experience of an independent small liberal arts college was something entirely different than it could be in North America. In North America, the institutions were designed for a general education to cultivate individuals who would be community leaders. As such, as extraordinary as the education could be, it also perpetuated certain problems. Designed to educate local and regional elites, these institutions all too often reproduce the forms of structural racism and gendered norms of sociocultural elites. They were legacy institutions with all the challenges and advantages that such legacies could produce. Like many of these colleges, ACP was anchored in a local Protestant church in its early years. It was a modest beginning for an extremely ambitious project. And as Lloyd DeLameter suggests in his memoir, it was an infinitely more daunting challenge than propping up a liberal arts college in the Midwest with ready investment by local elites looking to reproduce and ensure the sound education of their future leaders. This was a project that was at once at home, in that it might be seen as continuing some deep tradition of liberal arts in Paris, and yet foreign, especially by 1966, when France pulled out of NATO. As ACP established an American version of liberal arts designed, as DeLameter put it, to provide an American college experience in Europe. But it was also in so many ways distinct. American liberal arts colleges, since it was by necessity international, and would promote what I recently heard our president, Sonia Stevens, describe as a process of unsettling that comes with studying in such an international setting in such a dynamic city. This alone certainly challenged the comfort offered by cozy little wooded campuses of liberal arts colleges in New England or the Midwest. So ACP was at once reconnecting with the liberal arts tradition through the massive detour of American liberal arts colleges, only to return to challenge and give new meaning to both. When I was asked to speak today, I asked Bill what I should speak about, and Bill responded to the effect of cultural. He said, I think it would be interesting to focus on cultural exchange and engagement with international cooperation and AUP's legacy of openness to those ideas, which certainly spoke to me. And this idea certainly strikes me as sitting at the core of AUP's continuous engagement with founding and refounding itself. Exchange, engagement, internationalism, maybe even globalism, cooperation, openness. These would seem to be the ways that we continue to think about AUP's place in the concentric circles of Paris, Europe, the Atlantic, and the world. In speaking of his ambition in his memoirs, Lloyd DeLameter states that if, I quote, solid standard American class offerings were guaranteed, taught by professors from leading universities to motivated world-minded students, and the whole classroom experience were part of a meaningful international education experience, the result would be valuable, unique, and would surely succeed. I'm struck by how prescient this vision was, the idea of motivated world-minded students. Doesn't that sound like a global explorer, Tim? A whole classroom experience, things that we basically were talking about when we were talking about the GLAC reforms of general education. Meaningful international education experience. The emphasis on a holistic international experience seems to echo with so much of what we do, and yet he's talking about its founding in 1962 and what we are trying to achieve and in our individual departmental and research initiatives. And yet so many of the ways that we do this since Lloyd de Lamethter founded AUP and ACP in 1962 have radically changed. And in fact, one might suggest that every aspect of the very name of the institution has in one sense changed. First and most obviously the shift from ACP to AUP, which connotes, as Bill said, both the move from a small college to a full four-year university and now also with master's programs. Clearly, there's just a very different conception of what education means in such a context. Second, we always have to remember that in August of 1961, the construction of the Berlin Wall began, the great symbol of the division of Europe and the Cold War world. What it meant to be an American institution in Paris in these Cold War years, especially just after 1961, was in many ways overdetermined by the particular set of problems in this geopolitical and educational landscape. America, perhaps much more than the United States, were we the United States College of Paris or something, would have been quite different, but the American College of Paris, remains for some in Europe connected to notions of world expansion, capitalism, informal empire, and global hegemony. And yet there is no doubt that the place of an American-style institution in a post-Cold War world has deeply changed. Interest in American universities by Europeans and others across the world has grown tremendously. The particular contributions of an American-style education have been recognized. And even as geopolitical tensions obviously remain, the distance, perhaps, between Western European and American cultural experiences seem in so many ways to be converging. Moreover, our strictly American character perhaps remains in our independence and some of our procedures, modes of government, accreditation, etc., but it has been deeply impacted by the extraordinary international diversity that marks our student body, staff, faculty. From this perspective, sometimes I think the A stands more for the Autonomous University of Paris than the American University of Paris. And finally, Paris itself. And here one has only to look at the great film Chloé de 5 à 7, also appeared in 1962 by the great French director Agnès Varda, and compare that to the only slightly amusing Emily in Paris, to see how perceptions of the city and the travails of what it means to move in this extraordinary metropolis have changed. So, like France's Fifth Republic, AUP certainly more than remains. It is thriving, and in so many ways, it is at the same time deeply rooted in the first founding in 1962. And yet, even since I arrived, it has been continuously founded and refounded in new buildings, new curricular initiatives, new leadership, new faculty and staff, and the extraordinary waves of students that come, each contributing and challenging in their own way, and in so doing, transforming and shaping the university, the city, the processes through which we learn, and, as Lloyd de Lamethter put it, experience international education. Thank you. So the assignment, I'll just say the assignment was, I felt like an undergraduate getting, I was like, so it was a very, I need a clearer assignment. Yeah.
So I'm very interested in what you had to say about democracy. I'm also very interested in you compared the chef d'oeuvre of Agnès Varda to Emily in Paris. But that's a discussion we can have next.
I was contrasting.
So, how long do you think this movement's going to last with your experience with France and with the evolution of democracy? What do you see ahead? What are you thinking about?
Well, this article and the work that I'm doing right now to try to recover this tradition. I mean, part of it, I do think that France was historically actually the country to engage and embrace the word démocratie it was one of the first countries to understand itself as maybe doing something along these lines. And surprisingly enough, it was during the old regime. It was under the monarchy. And as I suggested here, it was understood to be a form of government and not a form of representative government. In fact, as I said, representative government, that is the power of a legislative assembly and elected officials, was very clearly seen as an antidote to the problems that democracy would pose. And in fact, in the founders of the American Constitution are very clear on this, and Sieyès is very clear on this. They're all very clear. And that's always been relatively paradoxical. And basically, by the late 19th century, there are what I refer to as two democratic traditions. There's in Europe, one sort of that's broadly speaking coming out of the fact that the British, by the end of the 19th century, have said, actually what we are doing is some version of democracy, even though the British overall remain relatively skeptical about that. And then there's this French tradition. Now, in the interwar period and then immediately after the Second World War, there is a sort of wholehearted embrace by the British that they do have a strong democratic tradition. And the democratic tradition that the French have been developing is essentially buried and seen this democratization of administrative power and regulatory power, and this sort of massification of administration is largely considered to be part of what fed the totalitarian move in the interwar period. And so one of these traditions is completely buried. Now, that continues throughout the Cold War, and in the post-Cold War is sort of its heyday, this sort of the idea that there really is only one history of democracy. It's about the emergence of civil society. It's about the emergence of very specific kind of rights talk. It's about legislative representation. And it's and this sort of last wave of democratization, that's what it's about. And what I'm trying to suggest is that there was actually, the country that was taking democracy most seriously during the first 120 years of its existence had a very different vision. And it was about democratizing regulatory, administrative, and governmental power. There are a lot of implications to this, but one of the ideas is that when we talk about a present day, when we talk about a crisis of democracy, I think partially what we're talking about is a crisis about a very specific type of democracy. And it's a democracy in which we run into all sorts of conundrums. For example, we are quite convinced that we need more environmental regulation, and yet we have never had such extraordinary distrust in government. So, you in the same conversation with somebody who, they're all, government is a mess. We can't trust anybody in government. This is a disaster. And you say, well, what are the major problems of the day? It's environment. Well, what should we do? Should we just let everybody decide how they're going to deal with their No, we need regulation. We need to have banking is the same thing. Technology, absolutely. So what I think part of the problem is we're missing the other half of the story. And that there's actually, we have almost 200 years of history of how people tried to democratize administrative and executive power. And it's not a history that we currently know. So that's the idea.
So this is going to last for a while.
So in terms, but as a historian, I love to make predictions, and they're always wrong. But if I had to, so based on that, if I had to guess, so. I don't know. My sense is that unless the Conseil Constitutionnel decides that the law is not constitutional, I really don't. I don't see the pressure. I don't see the. But I do think that the government is taking very seriously what's happening, and I do think it will have a tremendous impact on how the rest of the mandate unfolds. And with the hope that, of course, the other thing that everybody says is that the consequence of all this is going to be much worse than what we presently have, and that's, of course, the great fear. Yes?
I was just going to ask, isn't it more that, personally, I'm just thinking, if it's not the fact that, over 70% of the population, the French population, police reform and most of the like National Assembly, and that if they weren't using the 49.3 article, they would not be able to pass the reform if they were like going through like France.
Yeah.
And isn't that what is undemocratic and not necessarily like the foundation of the Constitution? And then my question would be, would the like I would wonder if the French, like if France in 1962, wouldn't they also consider this undemocratic? Because I know that in I think it was like in 2005 when it was like about the European like going to the yeah no but like going to the Euro or being
Yeah,
part of
the Maastricht Treaty.
there was a referendum.
Yep.
In 2005 I think.
That was on the European Constitution. Yeah.
Population decided not to.
Yeah.
Voted against it. Yet they still, yet
Yeah.
they still like the government or like the executive power didn't follow through. with that.
Yes, they did. So it was a rejection of the European Constitution, and France did not sign the Constitution, and then hence we do not have a European
But then
Constitution.
later on he did sign. I think.
No.
No.
No. But okay, so it's a great question. Okay, and it's exactly so. The question is the extent to which you think this is a question that we're seeing in Israel right now. It's a question that we're seeing is the extent to which a constitution can embody democratic principles. Now, whatever you think of the law and whether or not you think the Constitution of the Fifth Republic is sufficiently democratic, that's one question. But the way the law was passed is entirely constitutional. It's impeccable on that front. Now, what's being challenged therefore what I'm suggesting is what's being challenged is the Constitution really democratic that allows you to do this, right? Now, what's striking is that the person who has used the 49.3 the most is, of course, Michel Rocard, who was a second left socialist under Mitterrand. And when he was doing this, there was very little claim that what he was doing was unconstitutional. There was a claim that he was making stupid decisions and this and that, but by people on the right. But it was not that it was anti-democratic. Okay. So, and then what I'm trying to show is that there's a reason that the Constitution the referendum of 1962 was considered the great democratic moment of the writing of the Constitution that was established in 1958 by Michel Debré. And the question is, well, that makes no sense to us. In many ways, in our post-Cold War world, it says, well, obviously, it would be so much more democratic to have a referendum and to have the legislature pass the law. It can't be democratic to have it go through the 49.3. But what I'm trying to explain is why that struck people in 1962 as democratic, because they did think the Constitution of the Fifth Republic was profoundly democratic. And what made it democratic was because the president, which is a very exceptional situation around the world, the executive of France is elected by direct universal suffrage, which is a very weird system, right? And so you have accomplished what the great dream of democracy was during the French Revolution, in which always be suspicious of your legislative representatives because they claim to represent you. But what they're actually doing is looking after their own interests and this and that. What you really need is to be able to elect somebody for president who could be anybody, right? And that's what is truly democratic. And you always have to keep in mind that in 1958 you have you still have dictatorships on the European soil. You still have 8 or 9 monarchies. You have a divided East and West Germany with sort of other, and in France you have the direct election by universal suffrage. So things have obviously changed, and our conceptions of democracy have changed. Marc.
What is interesting is the fact that the French president, as of 62, became elected by the people directly, was actually a violation of the Constitution. And that de Gaulle himself used an article of the Constitution that was not meant to accomplish such a thing. with the fact that the Conseil constitutionnel was put into a situation where after the French voted, they decided not to go against the French vote and considered that the new amendment to the Constitution was constitutional when most specialists accept the fact that it should not have passed.
Yeah.
But it's also because that's what de Gaulle wanted to stop with, and that the party power prevented him from getting in 58. So, in a way, it's against the MPs, the members of parliament, that he had that voted upon.
Yeah.
What is interesting now is that, in a way, the direct election amplifies or sanctifies the hierarchical link between the executive and the legislative, whereas in the Constitution it's very much equal. But that, the fact that the president is the only person who is elected by a majority of French people, since the member of parliaments are voted upon by constituents and not the globality, that gives him the advantage, which is in line with 49.3, and now it's considered to be anti-democratic, and it's, you know, it's
Exactly.
kind of a
That's
so French.
you said it. Yeah. No, but it's that what democracy means. We don't even understand what everything you just said. You know, exactly, and that's why it was considered so democratic, especially since he did a referendum against the Constitution. I mean, and 90% of the French people voted yes. I mean, you know, this is almost a score that, you know, that doesn't happen very often, right? So no, absolutely. And so this is, you know, the fact that the word, what the word means, and the values associated with it have been completely reversed in just the time of the Fifth Republic is. But I think that's actually the key period right there.
No, I was going to say, so when they did the vote, it was 90%, was it with the General de Gaulle in the...
Yeah.
Well, then, couldn't one argue that it was also because of the position of the person who they were voting for, that influenced the
That happens in many referenda.
Yeah.
That's the case in many referenda, voting for the executive and not even answering the question.
The Communist Party has endured 1958, so, and they don't love Charles de Gaulle. Yeah. Any other? Okay. Yes.
Out of curiosity, where did this kind of conception of this government is no longer democratic come from? Was it from sort of like the popular quarters? Was it media centered? Or I'm very curious, and if this is something that is a recurring theme within.
Personally, I see it as relatively new. It's not something I remember in the streets of Paris. I see these people holding up signs that says, you know, some version of redonnez-nous notre démocratie, or, you know, démocratie, you know, en jeu. That vocabulary of democracy, it's not something, it wasn't common on the left, for the most part. And I mean, very broadly speaking, the left has always thought that democracy was a little bit of a kind of, you know, dust in the eyes, a little bit just trying to hide, you know, patch over to like human rights. It's like, oh yeah, you know, you ain't gonna talk about democracy. That'll really work, you know, that'll really solve the problems the social problems that we're facing. You know, what we really need. And so the fact that it's mostly coming from the left and the far left, and the fact that they're now adopting democracy as their language is very post-Cold War. You know, I would say it's 2000, you know, sort of 2015, 2016 that we started to see that. So it's a change, and it's interesting, and I think it's important. Yeah.
I also imagine it's quite amplified just by social media in general and that kind of echo chamber that we have created in specific political spaces, that it can be kind of commandeered both by the left and the right.
I think that's certainly true, but in the 1980s there was this whole literature on the social movement society. There was, what's changing is the language they're using to describe it. That's what's new. The fact that they're referring to this as, you're stealing my democracy. That's what, that's a very, during the Cold War and the immediate post-Cold War world, that's essentially, that democracy is not a strong word. It's kind of what the Americans do. It's not for radical politics. And so that's what changing. But I think you're right. I think there's no doubt that that social media is changing the landscape, and we have some great people working on that here at AUP. But Paris has been a city of revolution since, for a long time, and I actually haven't seen any substantial change in how radical the city is since I arrived 20 years ago. But thank you.
So I want to thank you both. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Susan. You used for really good insights about what's happening in the contemporary world, also insights in relating it back to the founding of the institution. I can't think of two better examples than what you brought to talk about today, Susan, talking about something that's coming out of the largest ground war in Europe since World War II and has been the framework for the way we've been here living in Europe for the last year and the world in which our students have been engaged. And Steve, to talk about what's out on the streets now and what we've been living with for the last couple of months and will be living with for a little while longer, even though you couldn't tell us quite how long it was. So both great examples, and both examples of a kind of strife of contemporary society that underscore the importance of the kind of education that we carry out at the American University of Paris. So thank you both very much.